Good evening. Welcome, everyone. It is such a great honor for me to introduce our speaker this evening, Professor David Edwards, James Lambert, Professor of Anthropology from Williams College. So it is an honor to welcome you to Doha. David Edwards has been conducting research on and writing about Afghanistan for more than 30 years. A graduate of Princeton University and the University of Michigan, he's the author of 3 books on Afghanistan: Caravan of Martyrs, Sacrifice and Suicide Bombings in Afghanistan, on which he will be talking about this evening, Before Taliban, Genealogies of the Afghan Jihad, and Heroes of the Age, Moral Fault Lines on the Afghan Frontier, along with numerous articles on Afghan history, religion, and culture. David Edwards is also the co-director and producer of the film Kabul Transit, which we have to see, which has been an official selection at many film festivals, including the Los Angeles Film Festival, the International Documentary Festival in Amsterdam, and the Independence Night film series at Lincoln Center in New York City. Edwards has received research fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and the National Science Foundation. In 2002, Edwards was named a Carnegie Scholar at the Carnegie Corporation of New York and taught at Charles University in Prague as a Fulbright Fellow in 2012-2013. He comes to us from Prague, the beautiful city of Prague, and we do look forward to your, what I would confirm to be a fantastic presentation.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Doha, so this is a new experience for me, and I've enjoyed it greatly. I'm talking today about a subject that is the subject of a book that I just published in the spring in the University of California Press with the title that you see there. And it was inspired by a long familiarity with Afghanistan. I went to Afghanistan for the first time in 1975, which I'm dating myself. I just graduated from college and I went there as an English teacher. It's an experience I've always been grateful for because I had the opportunity to visit and live in that country for 2 years before the war tore it apart. So I have a kind of a baseline perspective of Afghan culture that few other people, outsiders at least, have, and I think it has informed what I care about and also my great affection for the country and the people. But it also fuels my disappointment, my frustration, and at what's happened to the country. And on an intellectual level, on an emotional level, you have to deal with the disappointments and the anger that you feel over all the misery, the tragedy that's happened to a place like Afghanistan. You have to deal with it emotionally. But intellectually, I've tried to deal with it in part with this book, and some aspects of which I'll talk about this evening. My goal in writing the book is to try to understand how a phenomenon like suicide bombing, which would have been absolutely unimaginable when I first went to Afghanistan, and indeed would have been unimaginable for the first 20 years that I was there, how something like this could come into existence, where it came from. I'm an anthropologist by training, and so my perspective on it is both cultural, trying to understand the cultural roots of this phenomenon, as well as historical, because of the time span that I've had the opportunity to be in the country and to get to know Afghans. So in looking at it culturally and historically at suicide bombing, where it came from and how it relates to other aspects of Afghan culture, I sort of set myself apart from most of the people who've looked at this subject, which has been primarily from a point of view of political science, trying to understand suicide bombing as part of a political agenda, a political practice, or psychological. Many psychologists have tried to understand the psychology of suicide bombers. But there has been, in my reading of this literature, a kind of a disappointment at the absence of any kind of attempt to contextualize this phenomenon within the particular cultures, the societies in which it's taken place, in which it's arisen. So that was my own background on where I come from, both in terms of my perspective and how I see the way in which I approach the subject differently, and you'll have a chance to judge it for yourself as we go along. I also was in looking for a way to focus my book, my study of this phenomenon and how it's evolved. One of the things that struck me as central was trying to understand the idea of sacrifice. Now, sacrifice is a subject that has had a long interest in anthropology, and indeed it's a central concept in world religions. It's a central concept, for example, as you all know, in terms of Islam, both in the Eid al-Adha celebration, the ritual that takes place each year at the time of Hajj, which involves the sacrificial ritual, the sacrifice of a sheep in commemoration of the near sacrifice of Ibrahim's son. It's also perhaps even more centrally important in Shia Islam, given the importance of the story of Karbala, the sacrifice of Hussein and his family at Karbala. It's obviously important as well. In Christian faith, it's the central fact of the Christian faith as it's practiced, as it's believed in by Christians around the world, that Christ sacrificed himself to save humanity. It's also, you'll see in the slide here on the right-hand side, that's an image from Masada, which was the home for several years of Jewish zealots in the Roman period who held out against the Roman government in Palestine, in Judea, and Samaria. And the population of Masada was ultimately sacrificed, ultimately died by suicide by their own hand, rather than submitting to the rule of the Roman governors. So sacrifice is a central motif in the monotheistic religions. It's also central here. You'll see images of the Buddhist monk who in 1962, I believe, 61, immolated himself in a street in Saigon as a protest against the regime that was then running the government in Saigon. You see an image from Amritsar in India of the Sikh religion. It's also a central motif. If you ever go to Amritsar, you'll see that motifs of martyrdom and sacrifice surround or omnipresent in that city. And the third image I've shown is of a kamikaze pilot preparing to take off during World War II. So I mention these and bring up these images to talk in part about how important sacrifice is on a religious level. It's also important at a national level, a political level. Here are two images from the American context. The one on the upper part of the screen is of the American patriot, the sort of the Ur patriot, Nathan Hale, who asked to be hung rather than to submit to give up to the British government that was controlling the provinces, the American colonies, and immortalized the line that my only regret, I'm going to get this wrong, my only regret is that I have but one life to give for my country. The bottom image is of Abraham Lincoln on his deathbed. You'll see the caption at the bottom of the image is of the martyr President Abraham Lincoln, and there was a great cult of martyrdom that arose around Lincoln after his death as well. So you have both a political context and a religious context in which sacrifice has a sort of central role to play. To bring it up to date, I mean really up to date, up to the very moment that we are in right now, one of the points of that President Trump in the United States has been criticized for has been his failure to understand or to take seriously or to offer proper reverence for the sacrifices of American military. Here are three headlines, headlines from recent, within the last year, one of which talks about the criticism that has been leveled at President Trump for declaring that Senator John McCain, who was imprisoned and tortured for years in a Vietnamese prison when he was an Air Force pilot flying for the American military, Trump was criticized for saying that Senator McCain was no hero, that he was a loser because he was captured, and President Trump didn't like people who were captured. Last summer, during the Democratic Convention, a Native American citizen, native of Pakistan, Khizr Khan, and his wife spoke to the Democratic Convention to criticize President Trump for his ban on Muslims, and this was in response to statements, anti-Muslim statements that President Trump had made, and they themselves were the parents of a Humayun, who was a Marine who had joined the U.S. military and had been killed in Iraq. And finally, just yesterday, this headline on the bottom, Congresswoman says Trump told widow of fallen soldier, quote, he knew what he signed up for, which was, if you have seen the news today, this is the latest scandal / controversy involving President Trump, involving his failure to communicate with and offer proper condolences to the families of 4 soldiers who were killed in Niger. That he then subsequently tried to trivialize the signs of respect that ex-President Obama had made. So my reason for bringing these up is to show how volatile and how much emotional punch the issues of sacrifice hold. And the contexts I've given you are primarily American ones. But I think it's indicative of the way in which sacrifice the idea of sacrifice, the notion that someone is willing to give up something important, something vital for a cause, a state, a nation that they believe in. My own particular, now moving on to Afghanistan, my own particular interest is in how the ritual of sacrifice mutated, how it changed over time. And I begin in the book by relaying 2 stories that I collected, or I tape recorded while I did research in Peshawar, Pakistan with Afghan refugees in the 1980s. The 2 stories involved, one, a feud between 2 rival tribes that had went on for several generations on the eastern border of Afghanistan. And the second story was about an uprising by one of these tribes along the border against the Afghan government in the late 1940s. So why were these stories important? The feud story was important to me because one of the things that, a motif of that story that popped up again and again was that when one of the sides sued for peace, wanted to make peace with the other side in the feud, the ritual first step in initiating that peace was bringing a sheep. The petitioning side of that wanted to sue for peace would bring a sheep to a jirga, to a tribal assembly, sacrifice the sheep, and thereby indicate essentially that the register of interaction between the 2 tribes was moving from violence, from young men shooting each other, to talking, older men talking to each other. So in that context, sacrifice is actually a mechanism, an important kind of machine by which tribes initiated the process of making peace with one another. Exactly the opposite, of course, of what it would become later on, where sacrifice would be used to initiate and perpetuate violence. The second story that seemed important to me that I bring up in the beginning of the book has to do with this tribal uprising that took place in the late 1940s, in which one tribe, the Safi tribe of eastern Afghanistan, rose up against the central government. And the issues that they rose up about were primarily the efforts of the government to conscript young men to the army and also to tax them by a different system than they taxed them in the past. And one of the interesting elements of the story that I heard at this long account of this uprising against the central government was that a central concern of the people who rose up against the government was whether or not the people who died in the uprising would be considered martyrs, shaheed. Would they be considered shaheed? Would they have the blessing? Would they have the promise of paradise? And this became a source of considerable controversy and ultimately helped to unravel the uprising, to undermine the uprising against the central government. So here you have first case where sacrifice is used to undermine a state of feud, or to change a state of feud into the conditions for potential peace. The second brings up the whole issue of what is a proper sacrifice? What counts as a sacrifice? And can we talk about young men who've died in an uprising against the government as mujahideen and as martyrs? So that's the kind of beginning. In the course of my investigation, I went on to look at how this changed over time, how this ritual of animal sacrifice, the ritual of peacemaking, was changed into a ritual or a condition for martyrdom, for a different kind of sacrifice. So the first stage that I look at in my book, or the second stage after this initial consideration of the pre-war uses of sacrifice, involves the jihad against the Soviet occupation that began in 1979 and continued until 1989. This was a war that began almost immediately after the Marxist government took power in Kabul in 1978 with very little popular support. Initially, it was not considered, nor was it called a jihad. It was a national uprising. It was an effort to overcome a regime that was considered to be illegitimate, that had overthrown the government through illegitimate means. But over time, the resistance became, the uprising against the Marxist government in Afghanistan became increasingly controlled by Islamic leaders. And there were a variety of reasons for that. The Pakistan government played an important role in supporting Islamic political parties, and they funneled more weapons to these groups than to non-religious parties. But one of the key elements of it that I focus on in most depth is the role of Islamist parties that were run by young students or people who were young men who were in their 20s and 30s, people who'd been to Kabul University, who had a university education, and who had no traditional roots in Islamic learning or in Sufism. The traditional routes by which people gained Islamic status in Afghanistan were first as clerics, as people who had gone to madrasas, who had an elevated understanding of the Quran and Hadith literature. That was one avenue of political and social advancement. The second one was through Sufism. There were a number of hereditary Sufi families, Sufi peers, Sufi leaders who joined the jihad. Their offspring, the leaders of the Sufi tarikats, joined the jihad, and they were important figures in the jihad in the early years. But these two traditional sources became less important over time, and the Islamists, the young Islamists, became more important, both because they were tactically and logistically better able to mount offenses against the Soviets. They were more suited to learning how to fight a guerrilla war. But one of the critical elements of the success of these these parties, and here I'm talking about one party named Hizb Islami that was run by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, and a second party called Jamiat-e-Islami, which was run by Burhanuddin Rabbani, and whose most famous guerrilla commander was Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was killed in 2001. But one of the things that these Islamist parties succeeded at was in understanding the importance of martyrdom and the political salience and political potential of martyrdom for harnessing political legitimacy and political power. Now, to understand this, you have to take into account the fact that in the course of the first half dozen years of the war, of the jihad against the Soviet Union, people were killed indiscriminately. Tens of thousands of people were killed by bombing, by anti-personnel mines, by artillery shelling, and the kind of heroic combat that Afghans initially expected, in which young men would go into battle, was supplanted by a reality of warfare in which civilians were as likely to be killed as the soldiers themselves, the guerrilla fighters themselves. Children were killed, women and old men, old women were killed, villages were leveled. And in that context of so much destruction, so much of kind of random violence, they understood that martyrdom was a way in which they could interject themselves and interject their own political programs and essentially harness it. And one of the vehicles that they used to make this, to advance their own political prospects was through publications. And it wasn't just publications, it was also audio tapes, it was other forms of preaching and propagandizing. But they essentially created what could be called a cult of martyrs. Such a thing had never existed before, and indeed martyrdom as a concept in Afghanistan was not well developed until this time. And it was something that kind of initially people referred to their relatives as martyrs, people who had died. But these political parties understood that they could actually take control of this phenomenon. And they could decide and tell people, they could announce who was and who was not a martyr, who was and who was not entitled to the benefits of martyrdom. They basically kind of appropriated for themselves this right of announcing and declaring who was and was not a martyr. Now, one of the interesting aspects of this retrospective conferral of status on the dead was that it was also hierarchical. There was a way in which they decided not only who was and who was not a martyr, but who also was entitled to the conferral of greater status. And I have put on the screen a slide. On the back, in the black and white, are the back pages of one of the martyr magazines that was published by, in this case, Hizb Islami. In the back of the magazine, the obituaries, the commemorative statements are brief. They usually involve the publication of the identity photograph of the person who had died. But as you move from the back toward the front, and finally to the front cover of the magazine, you see that the people who are given pride of place, who are given the greatest status and the greatest space in the publications, were not even jihad commanders, not the commanders who'd spent years on the front, but rather they were students, people your age, who back in, say, late 1960s or the early 1970s had been arrested by the government in Kabul perhaps for handing out pamphlets or leaflets on the street, or who were accused of being members of one of the secret cells of the student Islamist political party at Kabul University. And they were arrested, and in many cases they were held in prison, and then when the Marxists took power, these young men, mostly were young men, were executed by the government. It's these men, because they were these young men, these students, because they were the first to join the political party, they were given the place of preeminence in the hierarchy, in the pyramid of power and status that was defined by Hezb-e-Islami and Jamiat-e-Islami. So that's one aspect, this development of a cult of martyrs, which was really important in changing the dynamic, the status, the hierarchy, the structure of the jihad in Afghanistan during the 1980s, during the Soviet period. Now, another aspect of it that's equally important, and perhaps even more important globally, internationally, was the role of a group of men who became known as Afghan Arabs. Arabs who joined the jihad, who went to Afghanistan to participate in the jihad beginning in about 1984. And there were two men in particular who were important. The one I'm sure you recognize on the lower part of the screen is Osama bin Laden, but maybe even more important in terms, at least initially, was a Palestinian religious scholar named Abdullah Azzam, who went to Afghanistan, who was one of the first to go, and who organized a bureau, an office in Peshawar, Pakistan, and began to recruit and propagandize in the Arab world, especially, but also in other parts of the world as well, with Filipinos, Chechens, Uzbeks. A variety of people were brought to Afghanistan at Abdullah Azzam's urging to join the Afghan jihad. And Azzam is important for a couple of reasons. One is that he was the person more than any other who declared that jihad was obligatory for Muslims, regardless of where they lived. Prior to this, the Afghan jihad was largely considered an Afghan problem, an Afghan matter. But Azzam said, no, jihad is obligatory, is an obligation for Muslims no matter where you are around the world. Equally important is another element of Azzam's ideology and of his contribution or his influence in Afghanistan, was that he published a number of books that were translated into a variety of languages. And there were some of the books, the ones that are most well known, are books that were about ideology, about jihad, about martyrdom as an ideological concern, looking at the Quran, looking at Hadith literature, about the role of jihad. But there were also two other books that were really important, and maybe in some ways even more important. One of them was essentially a book of stories about Arabs who'd gone to Afghanistan and who died there. It was what is known in scholarly literature as hagiographies. Stories of saints, stories of people who had lived exemplary lives and who had died. And in each of these stories, there are vivid accounts of the circumstances of the martyrs' deaths and also of the miracles that surrounded their deaths. And the second book that he published was a book that was specifically dealt with the miracle stories themselves. Stories about how, after the death of Arab mujahideen in Afghanistan, how when they were buried, how a shaft of light emanated from the sky down to their graves. Or stories about how a fragrant perfume emanated from the graves. So there were a variety of these different stories about miracles. And these stories were tremendously influential in terms of attracting the attention of the young men who became, who would leave their homes, in many cases prosperous homes, leave universities, leave the opportunities that they had in places like the Emirates or in Saudi Arabia or in other places, and they would come to Afghanistan to live a very different kind of life. And so Azam, I think, was extremely important in kind of recruiting, not just at an intellectual level, not just through ideological pronouncements, but through attracting young men with a romantic vision of jihad and martyrdom. The second person, of course, who matters is Osama bin Laden, who was the protege of Azam, and it was initially his ally. Bin Laden also romanticized jihad, especially through his poetry, which gave a kind of and one of the interesting things about that poetry, and I'm not a scholar of Arabic poetry by any stretch of the imagination, but talking to people who are, one of the things that I find interesting, and they tell me, is that bin Laden managed to evoke aspects of pre-Islamic poetry, the poetry of the Jahiliyyah, the poetry of kind of tribal Arab honor, and to harness that early Jahiliyyah poetry to the cause of jihad. That definite break between the Jahiliyyah, the time of Jahiliyyah, and the time of Islam kind of broke down as he used the Jahiliyyah, the martial spirit, that kind of the heroic spirit of Arabs to the purposes of jihad. That was one of bin Laden's contributions. The second, obviously, was his expansion of the territory in which jihad could take place. It wasn't just within the Dar al-Islam, it could also be abroad, as we ultimately, that resulted in the attacks against the World Trade Center and Pentagon in the United States. A third contribution to this whole process that bin Laden made was he also changed the whole nature of recruitment of young Muslims from around the world who would go to Afghanistan. He did it through his own personal visits all over the world, in which he recruited young students to the cause of jihad. But he also, probably more than anyone else at the time, understood the value of technology. The technology initially of audio cassettes, later of VHS cassettes, and DVDs that could extend the reach of his propagandizing. And as a matter of fact, these two images that I have on the screen here of Azam and bin Laden were both screen grabs that I took from a video that Al-Qaeda produced in 2001 on the bombing of the USS Cole. This was in the spring of 2001 that they produced this. The bombing of the USS Cole in Aden Harbor. So bin Laden recognized the media potential, both in terms of recruitment, but also ultimately the spectacle itself of the World Trade Center, of the bombings that he was able to use the Western media itself as a way of amplifying the impact of violence. I want to take a quick detour backwards, because we've gone up to 2001 and the attacks of September 11th, 2001. And I want to talk a little bit about the Taliban as well, and how the Taliban also contributed to the development of sacrifice, or the transformation of the idea of sacrifice, the practice of sacrifice in Afghanistan. When the Taliban took power in 1995, Afghanistan was in the midst of a civil war, and to even call it a civil war would be a little bit inaccurate. It was more of a kind of a state of anarchy, in which a lot of the Mujahideen parties that had fought against the Soviets and had defeated the Soviets in 1989 when the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, they became essentially entrepreneurial predators within Afghanistan. They had previously been paid for and they'd been financed. They got their weapons from the United States, from Pakistan, from Kuwait, from Saudi Arabia, and other states in the region. That pipeline of resource was cut off, and they essentially began the practice of predation against their own people. So into this environment, the Taliban came, and during one of the results of this period, this extended period of 5 or 6 years in which the Mujahideen parties were fighting against each other, is they lost their political legitimacy. And the importance of martyrdom itself, which had been so central a feature of their ideology and of their their efforts at political legitimization, martyrdom itself lost meaning. It lost its value, its political value. And one thing that the Taliban did that I think was of central importance was they began a campaign to of public moral policing that had never existed in Afghanistan before. It involved the punishment of women who were improperly veiled, of taxi drivers who were listening to Bollywood music in their taxi cabs, of young men who wore their hair too long. One of the styles at the time was in imitation of Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie Titanic. Afghan men started wearing their hair in what was called a Titanic style. All of these things became sort of subject to the Taliban policing. But even more, I think, telling and important was that the Taliban began the practice of executing, punishing offenders against public morality in large venues, in the central squares of cities, in the soccer stadium at Kabul, in Kabul, and of mandating that people would come to these events, these public spectacles. And I think why this is important and how this fits into my own particular trajectory, into the scenario that I'm presenting to you, is that this is a different kind of sacrifice. It's a sacrifice of collective violence, of scapegoating, of implicating the entire population in these acts of violence, of making people complicit in the violence of the state. And this was an extremely important part of the Taliban's attempt to create political legitimacy for themselves. So I want to now talk about what happened after the Taliban after Afghanistan was attacked by the United States, after they lost power, and the advent of suicide bombing itself. The first suicide bombing that happened in Afghanistan happened 2 days before the attacks on 9/11, when the anti-Taliban leader Ahmad Shah Massoud was killed by agents of Al-Qaeda members who had said that they were from a news bureau, Arab news bureau, wanted to interview him, and the camera that they were using was packed with explosives and killed Massoud just prior to the 9/11 attacks themselves, in the process thereby killing the person who more than any other was probably likely to lead the anti-Taliban efforts in Afghanistan. So that was the first suicide bombing. But there weren't very many. There were only a handful of suicide bombings that took place after 2001 until 2006, and that's when the numbers spiked. There were 105 suicide attacks. And one of the spurs to this upsurge of suicide attacks was a video produced by bin Laden that basically called on the Afghan people and Pakistanis and Afghans to follow the model of what Palestinians had been doing for some time, which was of using this suicide bombing as a tool, as a political tool, in this case against the Americans. So in 2006, the number expanded importantly. And while the Palestinian model, I think, was important, it provided a kind of understanding of the technology of how to do it. I mean, literally how to manufacture suicide vests and how to organize these campaigns. The way in which Afghans went about the suicide attacks themselves was quite different, and it was culturally integrated in Afghan society very different than it was in Palestinian society. Now, one aspect of suicide bombing, an important element of it, which made the campaign, made it possible for 105 suicide attacks to happen in 2006, was the existence of independent madrasas, religious schools in Pakistan. A large number of the people who were recruited, trained, indoctrinated to become suicide bombers at some point in their lives were at these madrasas. And these madrasas operated outside the control of the Pakistan government. The Pakistan government knew what was going on, but they didn't intervene. These madrasas were also an important source of manpower for the Taliban themselves back in 1995 when they managed to take power in Afghanistan. But the madrasa system was an important element, and I go in some length to talking about what happened in those madrasas and how that training took place and why it was that the madrasa functioned in this way. One element, though, I think that's really important is to understand how the young boys who went to the madrasas often went at a very young age. They were sent there by their parents who didn't, in large part because they couldn't afford to take care of the children themselves. They were put into this environment really that was separate from the domestic context in which which other boys had grown up. And they became isolated in these environments. They became subject to indoctrination without the intervening or mollifying effects of mothers, grandmothers, sisters, other people, fathers, brothers, other people. So they became extremely vulnerable to indoctrination. So total number between 2001 and 2016, there were, by one estimate, roughly 1,200 suicide bombing attacks in Afghanistan. The total deaths from those attacks was upwards of 5,000, between 5,000 and 6,000, by one estimate, one clearinghouse of information on suicide bombings. 5,000 deaths is a lot, but it's also, in a context like Afghanistan, it's not where so many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people died. 5,000 doesn't seem a lot, but I think it's important not to look at the effect of these bombings solely in terms of the deaths themselves, the deaths and casualties, the immediate casualties. More important, or at least as important, was the way in which it devastated public space, civil society, the efforts of the government to create confidence and legitimacy for itself, confidence in itself as able to provide security for the people, and as well as political legitimacy for its efforts. In Afghanistan, so much of trying to redevelop the society after 2001 depended upon a willingness of the people to believe that there was a future, that the efforts that they made to rebuild their agriculture, rebuild their homes, their communities, had some future. And one of the effects, I think, of suicide bombing is to essentially limit the temporal horizons within which people live. They have to deal only with the present. The future becomes an abstraction. And in that kind of context, it becomes impossible really to mobilize people to engage over a long period of time in the efforts of rebuilding the country. I think another important factor in understanding the rise of suicide bombing was the role of the United States and the way in which the United States failed to understand what was happening in Afghanistan, the way in which they imposed their own rule. I already mentioned how the arrival of the Soviets in Afghanistan was the condition of this kind of random violence, this massive destruction and loss of life that was an important precondition for the rise of a cult of martyrdom in Afghanistan. The Americans were more discriminating in how they used violence. They didn't carpet bomb villages or use poison gas the way that the Soviets had done. However, in some ways, I think the influence of the Americans was even more pernicious, more dangerous. And it had to do with three things in particular that I would mention. One has to do with the way in which they isolated themselves from the Afghan population. Building these blast protection walls, these compounds behind huge barriers, making it impossible for Afghans to get in, even for legitimate reasons, to get into see them, to have any kind of communication, any connection, any kind of social humanizing between the Americans and other coalition forces and Afghans. There were obviously legitimate reasons for their worry over their own security, why those blast protection walls were put in place. But one of the effects of it was to essentially make the Afghans and the foreigners who were nominally there to help them to live in different universes, and to have very little empathy or understanding of the mindset or of the others. Here's the second point I would make is that where the Soviets were often indiscriminate in their use of violence, of the use of munitions, of artillery, of bombing, Americans were more careful about their uses of violence, although there were numerous cases of for one reason or another, of bombing, of killing people who were in fact not hostile to the occupation forces, either because they got bad intelligence or one reason or another. So there were those cases where lots of people were killed inadvertently or because of bad intelligence. But more important, I think, in terms of how the American role mattered, was their tendency to search homes, to go into homes, to violate the sanctity, the privacy of the domestic compounds in which Afghans lived. And these stories about these home searches in the middle of night in which American soldiers dressed in their full battle gear, wearing helmets and night goggles, these stories became ubiquitous throughout the country and became sort of the symptomatic of how the Americans were not helping but invading the country. They were occupying the country, and this became the symbol of that occupation. Now, a third factor which began to matter more around 2008, 2009 was the use of drones, which continues to this day and which is obviously becoming such an important part of the conduct of contemporary warfare. Drones, besides the fact that drones have the ability to unleash a lethal strike against targets, they also have the ability to stay in the air for long periods of time. And particularly in the area along the eastern Afghan border, drones in South Waziristan, North Waziristan, where the Haqqani network and the Taliban are most influential, these drones would be kind of constantly flying, and to this day are constantly flying over. And the psychological effect, one of the things that the people who've gone to North Waziristan, South Waziristan, these areas say is that the constant buzzing, the constant whirring of these drones has a tremendous psychological impact on the civilian population. One Taliban commander said that before the Americans started using drones, he couldn't recruit more than a handful of people to become suicide bombers. After the Americans initiated drone surveillance over the villages, he said we had to turn people away because we couldn't manage the number of people who wanted to become suicide bombers. And I think part of it has to do with the psychological, kind of the constant surveillance, the constant presence of these drones over people's homes, the way in which it disrupts social life. People stopped going to the mosque. People stopped going to any places of public assembly out of fear that these would become targets, that they would be surveilled and they would be recognized as potential places where Taliban were meeting. So it had this fragmentation, this quality of fragmentation on civil society, civil life in areas that became one of the main sources of recruitment for suicide bombers. Finally, just a couple of last slides. The last part of the book, I talk about one of the ways in which the suicide bombing has moved into, and martyrdom have moved into social media, and the way in which the Taliban, ironically, the Taliban were famous back when they first took power in the late 1990s for their total disavowal and rejection of Western technology, their rejection of photographs, or rejection of media in general. And if you look at early Taliban magazines and newspapers, there were no photographs except pictures of buildings. No images of people were allowed. Well, the Taliban have become very sophisticated and very knowledgeable about how to use technology. And both the Taliban themselves and their official organs, but also people who are sympathetic to the Taliban and to the ideology of jihad against the current government in Afghanistan. And Facebook, Instagram, and other popular apps are one of the ways in which this is being manifest. And it's interesting. There are several ways in which I think there will be social repercussions for the migration of jihadist ideology onto social media that haven't been entirely recognized yet. One of those is that the ideology back in the 1980s, the ideology of jihad came from these political parties, from these few sources who were propagandizing, using their journals, their newspapers, their magazines, their audio cassettes, and they were controlling the flow of information. With social media, jihadist ideology is coming from a wide variety of sources. Some of them are institutional sources, alternative political parties, but some of them are also individuals. The majority of them are individuals. So there's a decentralization of jihadists and sort of this cult of martyrdom that's happened in the last few years. Another interesting development is the way in which social media has allowed women to participate in this rhetoric as well. And one of the posters on Facebook that I followed was a woman who I call in the book Abida, who was a frequent poster and who participated in this jihad dialogue along with accompanying and in response to men. And one of the things that struck me was that if you look at the place where it says the number of friends that this woman had, and again, I assume that she was a woman. All of her posts indicated that she was a woman. We don't really know who anyone is on Facebook. But if you look at the number of friends, this woman had something like 1,000 friends, and most of them were men. And I thought, no, in Afghanistan, a woman does not have male friends. Not outside of her family members and people who are somehow connected. That idea of having male friends and of having that dialogue with them was something that would not have taken place. Now it's taking place. Women are engaging in this impersonal medium with men in ways that they haven't before. And one of the things that Abida, the person that I referred to by that name, she posted pictures, for example, this woman holding a Kalashnikov. And so there was a way in which she was also, perhaps at least maybe in her imagination, but expanding the actual practical role that women would play. Women might play in the conduct of jihad. And indeed, in actual suicide bombing, one of the things that's happened in the last few years is increasing number of women who themselves become suicide bombers. As well as men who dress up as women because the burqa allows them to hide the suicide vest more effectively than male clothing does. At any rate, this is speculative on my part because I was limited to the extent to which I could interact with the people on Facebook, and ultimately I got shut down altogether and was unable to access the posts and the people who I was tracking. But clearly social media is a new domain within which, as we all know, with ISIS in particular, Daesh has used this very effectively in their recruitment efforts, use social media in ways that the Western governments haven't yet entirely learned how to control. But there are aspects of this that I think are going to be determinative in the coming years. So that's the end of my presentation. This is the cover of the book that I just published, and I'd be happy to take any questions.